So today we're trying something a little different, a new in-depth approach to book coverage with this extended summary.
That's right. Unlike our usual reviews, which are more of a focused analysis, this is going to be a comprehensive overview.
Exactly. We'll be tracing the intellectual roots, the key arguments, and the real-world impact of the subject.
And we really hope you appreciate this expanded format.
Yes, please let us know if you find it helpful. Your feedback really is what shapes our future content. Okay, so let's just jump right in with a pretty provocative hook. What if the entire sprawling, complicated history of the United States, I mean, we're talking 5 centuries of conquest, civil war, technological revolution.
All of this.
What if all of that was fundamentally just one giant, continuous running test?
A test specifically designed to see if 3 core principles could actually hold up against reality.
That is the incredibly ambitious framework that defines Jill Lepore's book, These Truths, A History of the United States. It's a single-volume narrative history that starts in 1492 and takes you right through the 2016 election.
It's an extraordinary feat of synthesis. What Lepore does is she structures this entire history around that famous line from the Declaration of Independence.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
Exactly. And she identifies those truths as political equality, natural rights, and the sovereignty of the people. So the book basically becomes a continuous question. Has American history confirmed those ideals, or has it, well, betrayed them?
It completely changes how you read it, knowing that's the central question. And before we dive into the 4 main sections, just a quick note for you. You are experiencing a unique 2-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book summaries.
So to start, what's really fascinating here is that Lepore isn't just writing a history of events. She calls it a history of truth claims.
What does she mean by that exactly?
She's explicit that the whole American project rests on a devotion to facts, to proof, and to evidence. The very idea that people can govern themselves only works if those people have access to a shared reality.
A shared set of facts.
Right. And the book constantly asks how that foundational requirement has been challenged over the centuries.
That sets up the first major section perfectly then. Part 1, which she calls The Idea, covering 1492 to 1799.
Mm-hmm.
You can't talk about those founding ideals without immediately hitting the founding paradox. Lepore starts with European arrival, conquest, disease, and the expansion that subordinated indigenous nations.
Exactly. This is where she shows the Enlightenment arguments about rights and government emerging right alongside the entrenchment of racial slavery. She argues they're inextricably linked.
So they're not 2 separate stories happening at the same time.
Not at all. Her central finding is that dispossession of land and forced labor weren't just blemishes on the system, they were built into the very structure of the new republic from the get-go.
So these contradictions are there before the Constitution is even drafted.
Precisely. Which is why she treats the constitutional framing as a contest over inclusion. She pays very close attention to who was writing the documents, but maybe more importantly, who was specifically excluded.
Women, enslaved people, indigenous population.
All of them. The ideals of political equality and popular sovereignty were immediately fenced off, creating this huge debt that the nation would spend the next 2 centuries trying to repay.
And often failing to.
And often failing.
That really sets the stage for the huge expansion we see in the 19th century, which leads us into Part 2, The People, covering 1800 to 1865.
Right. This is the era where you see the growth of mass democracy, but really only for white men. Suffrage expands, party politics explodes.
And this is where media becomes a major force for the first time, isn't it?
A huge force.
Yeah.
Party politics wasn't just happening in back rooms anymore. It was being fueled by mass-produced, highly partisan newspapers and pro-campaigns that could mobilize voters on a scale that was just unprecedented.
So popular sovereignty goes from a philosophical idea to something you can actually print and measure.
It becomes a political movement. And all this expansion, territorial, economic, it just intensifies the crisis.
You have Indian removal, the market growing like crazy, but then you also have the birth of these powerful reform movements.
Yes, abolitionism and women's rights. And they weren't on the periphery. They were the ones directly asking the question, who actually counts as a full member of the people?
They were forcing the country to confront the truth of its own claims about equality.
And as the fights over slavery's expansion got more and more intense, the whole party system just fractured. This is where Lepore makes one of her strongest arguments.
That the Civil War wasn't an accident.
It wasn't just a fight over union either. She frames it as the decisive test, the ultimate historical inquiry into whether a nation founded on the truth of equality could survive its own internal inequality.
Wow. So if the union failed, the ideals themselves were proven hollow.
That's the stake.
Yeah.
And this is where her focus on individuals really comes alive. You see figures like Frederick Douglass, whose very existence challenged the racist assumptions of the Republic.
Or the women's rights advocates using the language of the Declaration against the men who wrote it.
They're the agents pushing the country closer to its ideals, or dramatically exposing just how far away it was from them.
It's that constant tension between the documents and lived experience.
It is. And, speaking of documents and educational insights, this is probably a good moment to mention our YouTube channel.
Oh, absolutely.
It's called Mindful Moments, and we offer a lot of this kind of in-depth AI book analysis, summaries, critiques, all to inspire reflection and rational thought.
And honestly, the way these deep dives are structured is really valuable for aspiring authors, just to see how you can build such an ambitious narrative. So after the crucible of the Civil War, we move into, well, an era of broken promises. Part 3, the state, from 1866 to 1945.
It's a pretty sobering section. You see the Reconstruction Amendments, this brief moment of black political participation.
And then it's crushed.
Crushed, swiftly, by Jim Crow laws, disenfranchisement, and terrorism. The promise of equality is just stamped out by a massive backlash.
And this is all happening at the same time as this huge explosion of industrialization and urbanization.
Right. Labor conflict, the rise of huge corporations, the rules of power just fundamentally change. And the book shows how everyone, from reformers fighting poverty to business leaders seeking stability, they all turn to the growing national state.
The state becomes the tool you have to use.
The indispensable tool. You see it in progressive era regulation, the coordination for World War I, and then, of course, the monumental expansion of federal power during the New Deal.
The state just becomes massive, regulatory, institutionalized.
That leads right into the final part, the period of modern information warfare. Part 4, the machine, from 1946 to 2016.
The Cold War, the national security state, and then all the rights revolutions, civil rights, feminism.
All of them were still arguing for inclusion, for the fulfillment of those founding truths. But the key thread running through this entire section is technology.
The information systems.
Exactly. Lepore details how new media-first television, then national polling, and finally computers and the internet just profoundly changed everything. Campaigning, news, political communication itself.
And this is where the crisis of truth claims really comes to a head.
It becomes acute. Television makes personality and image more important than shared facts. Polling redefines popular sovereignty as just a fluctuating public opinion.
And the internet just accelerates polarization.
Radically. It creates echo chambers and intensifies disputes over the basic shared facts you need for a democracy to even function.
So the machine in the title refers to both the state bureaucracy and the technology of mass communication.
Precisely. And she argues this acceleration leads directly to the culture wars, to partisan realignment, and eventually to the crisis that culminates in the 2016 election.
Which is presented not as some strange outlier, but as the latest episode in this long, long struggle.
This centuries-long struggle over truth, evidence, and democracy itself.
And to make that story feel real, she does something so important by including figures you don't always hear about.
Yes, people like Jane Franklin Meekum, Benjamin Franklin's sister, or the early black activist Maria Stewart. It shows how marginalized people experienced and contested these huge political changes.
And she balances that with key conservative organizers.
Like Phyllis Schlafly. It shows that the fight over the meaning of the people was a constant contest, waged by everyone across all parts of society.
So looking back at the whole arc of the book, what is it that holds this massive narrative together?
It's her constant return to tangible structures. She's always coming back to the core documents, the Magna Carta, the Declaration, the Patriot Act, and to the institutions.
The courts, political parties, the media systems?
Right. Those are the concrete things that either implement or undermine the abstract ideals. They make them real.
And if you had to boil down the one thematic conclusion that just keeps coming up century after century,
I would say it's the relentless tension of inclusion. Every single time the people expands, every step toward greater equality, it's almost immediately met by a fierce, organized, and often successful backlash.
creating new forms of exclusion.
A new form of disenfranchisement. It's this continuous demanding cycle of progress and regression.
That, I think, is the huge value of this work. It offers a framework for understanding American history not as some settled story, but as this continuous demanding test of its own ideals.
It really forces you to recognize the critical role of information, of verifiable evidence in just maintaining a democracy.
Which leads right to her final move in the book's epilogue.
Yes, she poses the question directly to you, the reader. After seeing this whole historical record she's laid out, the violence, the progress, the betrayal, does it ultimately vindicate or betray those founding truths?
And she doesn't answer it for you.
No. She deliberately leaves that final, difficult judgment up to you. It's a powerful call to civic responsibility.
Click the link for the in-depth book critique, subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally. See the many genre-based book podcasts and mindful moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.